You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. The road had not been used in years, not since the earth had collapsed along its spine, cutting it clean from the town it once served. Grass had grown through its cracks. Warning signs had rusted to illegibility. Yet still, that night, a route request had come in. At 3:12 a.m., a signal had lit up on the old dispatch terminal, a location far beyond the marked perimeter, coordinates buried beneath layers of fog and neglect. The vehicle had already been on its 5th hour of night service. Only 2 passengers had been taken that shift, both unremarkable, both dropped safely in the center of town. The route had offered no bonuses, no urgency, just a silent blinking icon, a lone request from the edge of nowhere. And the vehicle had answered. The air had turned heavy as the engine moved beyond the limits of the familiar. No other cars had passed, no animals had stirred, just asphalt swallowed by mist. Headlights had struggled. What should have been a clear beam had fractured within seconds, scattered by fog so dense it appeared sculpted. Then at the fork of a bent speed sign and a collapsed barrier, a figure had appeared. She had been standing still, unmoving, drenched. A long garment, possibly once a dress, clung to her frame like a second skin. Hair hung heavy, obscuring her face entirely. Her arms had remained at her sides, her chin slightly tilted downward. She had not raised her hand. She had not needed to. The vehicle had stopped, the door had opened, and she had entered. No name had been exchanged. No destination had been given. She had simply lowered herself into the rear seat, bringing water with her dripping slowly, consistently, onto the upholstery. The temperature inside the car had dropped by several degrees, but no heater had been activated. As the engine resumed, the GPS had failed to reload. No signal had returned. No coordinates could be followed. Only her presence had offered guidance. Whenever the vehicle had slowed in hesitation, her hand had lifted, one index finger, pale and soaked, pointing forward. She had not looked up. Her face had remained concealed by hair. Her breath had not been heard. Her body had not shifted. She had been stillness made physical. The road had twisted more than memory recalled. Signs had vanished. Landmarks had faded. Every turn had felt repeated, every mile longer than the last. The radio had begun to emit static, not sharp, but soft, like distant wind through wires, and the scent had changed. Not smoke, not wet earth, but decay. The sweetness of something old, rotting slowly beneath something newer. At one point the vehicle had passed through what once might have been a bridge. The guardrails had been missing. The drop on either side had been masked by fog. She had pointed again, not forcefully, not urgently, just forward, as if something waited beyond that could no longer be delayed. An hour, perhaps more, had passed before the forest had returned. The trees had risen like spectators, narrow trunks, their bark pale under the haze, branches reaching inward, forming a canopy of broken silhouettes. The road had narrowed. The silence had grown deeper, the scent had thickened, and in the mirror the driver had looked up, not to check the road, but to finally face her. What had been expected was a face, even if wet, even if blurred, even if strange, but no reflection had met the gaze, not even a shimmer of movement, only the soaked fabric of the rear seat, growing darker, as water continued to pool beneath her. The mirror had captured nothing, no outline, no distortion. No presence. The seat had held her weight. The floor had gathered her water, but the mirror had shown emptiness. In that moment the air inside the car had shifted again, now heavier, sharper, humming just beneath the surface of silence. The vehicle had stopped. A breath had been drawn, a name almost spoken, and then the seat had been empty. The seat had been left soaked. No sound had marked her departure. No opening of the door, no shift of weight, only the water remained, seeping into the seams of the upholstery, spreading in slow, dark rings. The engine had been cut, the surrounding trees had whispered nothing, even the insects, ever present in such woods, had disappeared. There had been no movement, no wind, just an unnatural stillness, so complete it had felt staged, the kind of silence, not born from absence, but from something holding its breath. Through the fog, just beyond the faint cone of headlights, she had been seen again, this time among the trees, standing as before, unmoving, soaked, arms limp by her sides. Her head had been tilted slightly to the right, not enough to appear broken, just enough to seem wrong. No tracks had marked her passage. No trail had led from the vehicle to where she now stood. She had simply reappeared, deeper in the woods, partially veiled by the drifting mist, and one arm had been raised again, not to beckon, not to threaten, just to point. A decision had been made then, not rational, not conscious. A foot had pressed the gas pedal. The car had moved forward, slowly at first, then accelerating as if trying to escape something it didn't understand. The trees had passed faster, the fog had parted, but only in small threads, like fabric torn just enough to see shapes behind it. But no matter how far or fast the car had traveled, the forest had not ended. The road had stretched far beyond any known path. Even the tires had begun to sound different, as if rolling over a surface that did not fully wish to be touched. Then up ahead, something had emerged, a gate, or what remained of one. Stone pillars cracked by time, an iron arch overhead bearing no words, only scratches and moss. Beyond it, the path had turned to gravel. The car had stopped again, as if by force. The wheels had locked. The engine had stalled, though no keys had been touched, and in the mirror something had changed. Her reflection had returned, but she had not been inside the car. The seat had remained empty, yet the mirror had now held her shape, her soaked hair, her tilted head, her face still hidden behind the curtain of strands. Her hand had not been pointing anymore. It had been resting gently on the shoulder of the seat, inches from where a driver would sit, but nothing had been felt, only seen. The smell had worsened, not wet soil this time, something richer, something rot, like leaves left in stagnant water, like forgotten things, buried too shallow. Breath had become harder to draw, as if the air itself had thickened. The lights of the car had flickered, and the dashboard had glitched, the clock resetting to a blinking 4:00, even though no signal had been re-established. Then came the sound, not from outside, not from the radio, but from within the rear-view mirror, a single wet breath, sharp, drawn in, as if lungs that hadn't worked in years were learning again how to inhale. The mirror had fogged, not from breath in the cabin, from the other side, as if there had been a space behind the glass, a space now occupied. The car had been placed in reverse without instruction. The steering wheel had turned slowly, and when the accelerator had been pressed again, it had not responded. The car had begun to move backward, by itself, not in panic, in ritual, as if it had joined something greater, something rehearsed long ago, and all the while her reflection had remained, staring, unblinking, unmoving, present. When the vehicle had finally returned to the old highway's start, the fog had lifted suddenly, the road had revealed itself again, and the air had lightened, but only slightly, enough to see, not enough to forget. The back seat had dried completely, as if time had reset, as if nothing had ever happened. Only one thing had remained. The seat belt she had used had been locked in place, stained faintly with something dark beneath the clasp, and beside the driver's profile on the dispatch screen, a message had appeared. Not a warning, not an error, just 3 words: last passenger, undelivered. After that night, the car had been parked during every overnight shift. No rides had been accepted past dusk. No detours had been made beyond the town's last gas station, yet the presence had not remained confined to the road. Each morning, the seat had been found damp, not soaked, just lightly moistened, as if something had rested there briefly before vanishing again. The dampness had appeared even after deep cleaning, even when towels had been placed, even when the rear seats had been removed entirely, always in the same spot, always at the same depth. The stain had begun to shape itself, not randomly, not in blotches, but as a form, a pair of shoulders, the curve of a spine, a slight indentation as though hair had dried there. The dispatcher had grown impatient. 3 more signals had been sent, all originating from the same location, all ignored. No history of them visible the next day, only phantom requests, unlogged but undeniably present. Each time a signal had come through, the terminal screen had blinked once. 031. Every time, even when the system clock had been reset, even when the router had been replaced, even when the power had been cut completely, just to cease, the blink had returned. That number, 312, had begun to show elsewhere, on receipts, on odometers, on the corner of mirrors, like fingerprints burned into the glass. One night, while idling in a supermarket parking lot, a figure had passed behind the rear windshield, brief, blurred, but distinct. She had not turned to look, but she had lingered, close enough for the scent to reappear, the scent of wet leaves and closed graves. When the interior light had flickered, the mirror had darkened once more. No reflection had formed, only a faint shape pressing from the inside out, a handprint, fingers long, wrist narrow, palm soaked. The ride history log had corrupted the following morning. Every entry had vanished, all replaced with a single word: incomplete. Not cancelled, not expired, incomplete. As if something had been started and never finished. As if a journey had been denied its destination. Sleep had grown difficult. Each night had brought visions, not dreams. Images of trees twisting into themselves. Bridges folding downward like paper. Mirrors filled not with faces but with water, rising slowly on the other side of the glass. One night during a storm, a puddle had been found inside the front seat. Rain had not entered. No windows had been left open. Only the puddle and the seatbelt pulled across the driver's side, already buckled. The scent had returned, worse now, less like rot, more like something that had waited too long. The back seat had begun to creak, even when empty, as if something shifted its weight during sharp turns or leaned forward at red lights. Sometimes, when the vehicle passed a certain stretch of highway, the headlights dimmed for one exact second, never more, never less. And in that second, the radio had played her breath. Not a gasp, not a sigh, just a slow inhale, like something rising from below the waterline. Every time the vehicle had been turned off, the dashboard had blinked one last message, awaiting route. But no destination had been listed, no passenger had been assigned, only that phrase, always at 03:12 a.m. The vehicle's driver profile had changed. It had once read, active, night shift, then limited hours, then restricted. Now it had read, assigned final ride, no ride number, no duration, no time stamp, just the status, and below it, a note had been burned faintly into the metadata, back seat occupied. The car had stopped responding normally. Keys had turned by themselves. Headlights had activated at dusk. Regardless of settings, mirrors had tilted slightly downward at every idle, as if lowering to observe something resting just out of view. And always the back seat had remained slightly damp, not soaked, not puddled. Just enough moisture to stain denim, enough to carry scent into skin. No one else had noticed. Passengers had stopped booking night rides entirely. The vehicle had remained unrequested past midnight. But the dispatch terminal had still blinked at 03:12 a.m. every night, without fail. The same coordinates, the same label, last passenger undelivered. By the third week, the engine had begun to hum when parked. Not while running, while silent. A frequency barely perceptible, felt more than heard, like a heartbeat pulsing from beneath the chassis. Mechanics had been brought in. They had heard nothing, seen nothing, but each had reported nausea. 2 had requested to never return. The final night had arrived without warning. No call had been made. No request had been shown. The vehicle had started by itself, softly, smoothly. The clock had displayed 03:12. Outside, the fog had returned, thicker than before. No moon, no stars, only the twin beams of headlights splitting the void like weak threads. And as the tires had begun to roll forward, the GPS had activated. A destination had appeared, not a name, not a point on the map, just a word: finish. The road had changed, no longer familiar, no longer earthly. The lines had blurred, trees had twisted, silhouettes had stood unmoving at the edge of visibility, too tall, too thin, waiting. And the voice, her voice, had returned, not in the cabin, not in the air, in the mirrors, a soundless whisper, rising like steam behind the glass, forming shapes, then letters, then a name, not hers, not his, but yours. The road had ended, no cliff, no sign, just absence, a space where matter had seemed unsure of itself, where the car had hovered briefly, before halting without friction. The headlights had cut, the dashboard had gone dark, and in that absolute stillness, a final presence had been felt, not entering, emerging, from the back seat, from the mirror, from every inch of soaked fabric and flickering bulb. She had arrived fully, no longer a reflection, no longer a silhouette, a form, pale, leaning forward, eyes closed, mouth open, breathing. The final sound had not been a word, it had been a release, as if the name she had carried all this time had finally been spoken, silently, into the chest of the one who had refused her. The mirror had fogged once more, a handprint had spread across it, but this time, from the driver's side. The vehicle had been found 2 days later, parked neatly at the edge of an old trail, doors locked, interior dry, engine cold, no sign of the driver, no GPS data, no call logs, only one note on the terminal: last passenger, delivered. And on the rear-view mirror, etched faintly into the surface, barely visible under certain light, back seats still reserved. In the stillness of childhood, certain sounds had always lingered longer than others. Not footsteps, not creaks from old wood, but something deeper, a presence shaped like noise, yet never understood. It had begun in the winter of her 4th year. The house had stood at the edge of a frost-bitten cul-de-sac, facing an empty field where nothing ever grew, a solitary structure, neither old nor new, caught in the strange limbo of quiet suburbia. The girl Elena had not been known for fear. Her days had been filled with colors and stories, pixels and cards, puzzles and toys, and her mother had always been nearby, in some corner of the house, humming or cleaning, a gentle presence behind every door. But that winter, a sound had arrived. She had been seated on the wooden floor of the kitchen, knees bent, back straight, a digital world unfolding on her small screen. Outside, sleet had tapped lightly against the glass, and the heater had hummed in rhythm. Then, without warning, the air had shifted. It had not cooled, it had not stilled. It had simply changed, subtle, but undeniable. And then came the word, not spoken, not shouted, but delivered, as if pushed through the walls themselves, inaudible in meaning, clear in form, a single syllable, heavy with intent. It had echoed behind her, not from the hallway, not from the screen, but from nowhere. Elena had frozen, fingers hovering mid-click, skin prickling with sudden awareness. Her voice had trembled as she called for her mother, but no answer had returned, only silence, deep, absorbing, final. It had been minutes or seconds before the sound of running water had resumed down the hall. The house had breathed again. The air had returned to normal, and Elena had gone back to her game. But she had never truly left that moment. In the weeks that followed, the house had continued on, Dust had settled, groceries had been put away, books had been read aloud, but something in her world had shifted. The corners of rooms had felt darker. The shadows under furniture had stretched just a little farther than they used to, and sometimes when she had turned off a light, she had hesitated before leaving the switch, not from fear, from awareness. One afternoon during a gray-skied Thursday, she had been alone in her room, sorting through cards, some bent, others shimmering, a world of names and creatures arranged by logic only a child could follow. Music had played softly in the distance. The hum of the vacuum cleaner had rumbled downstairs. The air had smelled faintly of lavender from a nearby candle her mother had lit hours before. Then again the word had come, different tone, same absence of meaning, but this time it had not come from behind. It had emerged from inside the closet. The sound had not touched her ears. It had pressed directly into her mind like a whisper made of static. Her skin had gone pale. Her breath had stopped. And for a second, just one, her vision had blurred at the edges. Then the silence had crashed in. All noise, vacuum, music, wind had vanished. Only the closet door had remained, shut and unmoving, unopened, uninviting, unchanged. She had screamed. Her voice had cracked. Her legs had stumbled. The cards had scattered in all directions like frightened birds, and she had fled down the stairs through the narrow hallway into her mother's arms. There, sobs had shaken her small frame, and words had failed to form, because how could a child describe a sound that had never truly spoken? Her mother had held her, offered warmth, calm, a smile. The vacuum had been turned off, the closet checked, the candle blown out, and life had moved on. But that sound, that unspoken word had carved itself into Elena's memory, not as trauma, but as a presence left unfinished. The years had moved on, quietly, like dust layering an unused room. Elena had grown, not suddenly, not rapidly, just enough for the world to expect her to forget. But forgetting had not come easily. She had stopped speaking of the sound, not because it had stopped, but because it had changed. It had become quieter, more subtle, a soft pressure behind the walls, a faint vibration in her bones when silence fell too completely. Most children had monsters under their beds. Elena had one that waited in language. The house had shifted over time. New coats of paint, furniture rearranged, doors replaced, but her closet had remained untouched. The handle had loosened, the hinges had creaked, but the door had never been removed. No one had dared. Even her mother, who prided herself on order and renewal, had left that single panel of wood untouched, perhaps instinctively, perhaps unknowingly. But the door had been left alone, and it had remembered. The word had never returned in full again, not like the first two times, but fragments had surfaced. Moments when Elena had turned off a faucet and heard the tail end of a breath. Moments when music had paused and the sound had filled the void too quickly, like something waiting behind silence. And most curiously, it had always come when she was alone, never with others, never while watched, always in solitude. At the age of 12, a dream had arrived, not chaotic, not surreal, just true. She had stood in her room, aged as she was. The air had been still, the furniture had looked real, and the closet had stood open, though she had never seen it open in life. Inside, no darkness had waited, no monsters, no glowing eyes, just a mirror, smooth, unframed, reflecting everything in the room, except her. In the dream, her body had moved forward, drawn to the glass, but her reflection had remained absent, not delayed, not hidden, simply missing. And then, from behind the mirror, the word had arrived again, not heard, known, not spoken, understood, a single syllable, carved into the center of her mind, still without meaning, but heavy with purpose. She had awoken gasping, her throat had burned, her fingers had trembled, and the closet door had stood ever so slightly ajar. In the days that followed, Elena had tried to dismiss the memory. Dreams were nothing, the mind was strange. But patterns had begun to emerge. Static had filled her headphones at odd times, sharp and brief. Lights had flickered when she stood near her closet, and in the mirror above her dresser, Her reflection had blinked too slowly, as if waiting for something she hadn't yet realized. One night, as wind battered the windows and branches scratched against the rooftop, a low humming had started behind the walls. It had not been electrical. It had not matched any mechanical source. It had been throat-like, a resonance, not loud, but felt pressing gently on her ribs like invisible fingers. And once again the word had risen, this time, not from the closet, but from under her bed. She had not moved. She had not screamed. She had simply frozen, familiar now with the presence, resigned to its rhythm. And as her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, she had noticed something strange. The space under the bed had looked deeper than it should, longer, almost endless, like a tunnel no one had built, opening beneath her without sound. She had stared into it for what felt like hours, and in that span of stillness, a thought had arrived, not her own, but given the word was not a warning. It was a name. Hers, its. She couldn't tell, only that it had meaning, and the meaning had not yet been earned. The next morning, she had checked beneath the bed. Nothing had been there. No tunnel, no depth, just dust in the forgotten corner of an old notebook. But the sound had stayed with her, as had the understanding. The presence did not haunt her, it recognized her, and it was waiting. By the time she had turned 15, silence had ceased to be comforting. It had become predictable, not in its absence of sound, but in the way it behaved. Each time silence had settled too cleanly, too quickly. It had been followed by presence, that familiar shift in the air, that tingling at the base of her neck, that invisible weight pressing softly against her chest. The word had not returned since the night of the tunnel, but something else had taken its place. Patterns. The mirror had begun to darken at random, not visibly, not to the eye, but when she had stood in front of it, her reflection had delayed, by half a blink, by a breath, enough to notice, not enough to prove. Sometimes her reflection had smiled when she hadn't. Other times it had appeared closer than it should, as if it were leaning forward ever so slightly. These moments had not caused fear, only stillness. Elena had stopped telling anyone, not because she thought she was alone, but because she knew she wasn't. One evening in late autumn, as leaves turned brittle and air began to sharpen, she had stood at the kitchen window washing a dish. The house had been quiet. Her mother had stepped out for grocery. Dusk had painted the horizon in soft purple haze, and as the last plate had been set to dry, she had turned and felt it, not behind her, but through her. The presence had not entered the room. It had risen inside it. The way warmth rises in a closed oven, slow, inescapable, dense. The lights had dimmed without flickering. The hum of the refrigerator had ceased. And once again, that soundless word had brushed against her skin. This time, she had followed it, not in body, but in memory. Her feet had moved without direction, through the hallway, past framed photos, toward her room. Not the closet, not the bed, but the mirror. There, she had stood before it. Older now, steadier. The glass had shown her face, but not her eyes. They had remained dark, not void, just closed, though hers had been wide open. Her hand had reached up, not by choice, by invitation. Fingertips had touched the glass. It had been warm. And then a shape had formed behind her, not in the room. In the reflection, a silhouette, thin, too tall. Head tilted at an unnatural angle. It had not moved, only watched. Its face obscured by blur, its body hazy, as if underwater. But she had known. It had been the voice. Not a man, not a monster, not a ghost. A mouth, a being shaped around a single purpose, to deliver the name. Her name, its own, she still didn't know, but as it stood there, silent, mirrored, Elena had realized the truth. The word had not been spoken to frighten her. It had been spoken to mark her. That night, a storm had arrived without warning. Lightning had cracked across the sky, though no thunder had followed. Rain had lashed the windows in perfect intervals, like tapping fingers, and from within the closet, the word had returned, louder, clearer, more defined. Not through language, through presence. She had not opened the door. She hadn't needed to, because it had already opened from within. Her mother had found her asleep at her desk the next morning, unharmed, unbothered, eyes flicking beneath her lids as though dreaming deeply. But she had not been dreaming. She had been listening, because in the dream, or what had replaced dreaming, the word had begun to take form. Letters not recognized, sounds without alphabet, but meaning soaked in recognition. It had not yet been complete, but it had been growing stronger, and somewhere, just outside the edge of what could be seen, the mouth had smiled. Sleep had become unreliable, not restless, irrelevant. Time had bent in small ways. Minutes passed faster than hours, or stretched into eternity with no warning. Elena had stopped tracking it. She had learned to live between moments, not within them. The house had grown quieter with every passing week, not due to absence, but due to resonance, as though the walls had begun to absorb sound instead of reflecting it. Even her mother's voice had grown thinner, present, yet distant, like an echo returning from too far away. No one had noticed, no one, except Elena. The mirror had darkened permanently, not to black, not to fog. It had become depth, a surface that reflected, not the world behind her, but something older, something beneath. She had stopped checking it for her reflection. By then she had known it wasn't hers anymore. The girl it showed blinked too late, breathed too shallow, smiled when she didn't, and sometimes briefly. It watched her before mirroring her again. The closet had become irrelevant. The word no longer lived there. It had outgrown the room. Now, the presence moved with her, not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as a memory that remembered itself. It had become part of her spine, her steps, her silence. At school, words had begun to sound distorted, too fast, too slow, sometimes not at all. She had stopped responding, stopped speaking. No one had pressed her. Teachers had assumed distraction. Friends had faded like wallpaper. She had become the quiet girl with the tired eyes. But the truth had been far stranger. She had become a vessel. The sound, the name had nearly returned now. Each night brought a new syllable. Each moment of solitude carried fragments, like pieces of static forming a single thought. And when the final piece arrived, she would not hear it. She would become it. One afternoon, in the hallway near the laundry room, she had paused mid-step. Time had folded, cleanly, like a page in a book, and she had stood face to face with herself. Not a reflection, not a shadow, a perfect copy, silent and still, with the exact expression she had never made. They had stared at each other, and between them, in the air, written not in ink, but in existence, the word had hovered, complete. It had not been read, it had not been spoken, it had simply been understood. And in that instant, Elena had known. This was not an entity that followed her. It was not a haunting. It was a becoming. The word had never been meant to be heard. It had been meant to grow, to embed itself, to use a life as soil. And she had been chosen not for fear, or weakness, or sensitivity. She had been chosen because she had listened. The presence had no desire, no motive, no hunger, only continuity, to exist again, to take shape once more in flesh and breath. And now, through her, when her mother had called for her that evening, no answer had come, only a soft hum, vibrating through the walls, the sound of air held too long. The bedroom had remained undisturbed, nothing missing, nothing broken, only the mirror. It had become clear again, as if the darkness had been wiped clean, and in its surface, one could now see a room, a girl, and a reflection that never looked away. To this day, no one remembers when Elena stopped speaking. Some say she moved, others claim she faded. But in that house, sometimes when everything falls too silent, a single sound can be heard, not a whisper, not a voice, just a word with no language, no origin, and no end. It speaks not to the ear, it speaks to you, and if you ever understand it, you'll never speak again.